and thank you for calling Hotline 21. This is a live call-in television show. My name is Angela Moss. I am a domestic violence counselor and advocate from Connections for Abused Women and Their Children. Today I will be talking to you about different aspects of domestic violence during the 20 or 25 minutes. If you want to call into the show, you can call into the show and ask any questions or comments. The questions that you will call and ask or comments can be called into 312-738-1060. So I guess I will start by saying, domestic violence, what is it? Domestic violence has different definitions for different people, but the definition that I'm going to use is domestic violence is a pattern of coercive behaviors that's inflicted on one person to the next person. The other thing that I would add in terms of just definition about domestic violence is that it doesn't discriminate against age, gender, sexual orientation, economic level, education, and things of that nature. So what am I saying? Domestic violence can occur with any person, right? The other thing that I want to talk to you about today, and one of the questions I often get is, how do I know if I'm in an abusive relationship or a relationship that has domestic violence in it, right? There's a couple ways that you can kind of identify that. So one of them, I use this sheet often, it's called, you could be in an abusive relationship if, right? You can be in an abusive relationship if you are often worried about your partner's moods and change your behavior to deal with them. So that's one thing to think about. Am I in that type of situation? The other thing you can think about in terms of red flags and trying to identify if you're in an abusive relationship, if you feel like you're walking on eggshells, right? So let's talk about what walking on eggshells would look like. It would just mean that you're in this relationship where you're afraid. You're afraid to talk. You're afraid to say certain things around that person that you're in a relationship with. So kind of fragile, right? Eggshells are kind of fragile. So you feel like you're walking on eggshells, right? The next point and another red flag is that you don't see your family or friends to avoid that person's jealousy. Right. So, of course, you have family and friends, and for many people, family and friends are individuals that keep that person going. Right. So, in abusive relationships, what happens because of power and control issues, the other individual may say, for example, let's say I'm in a relationship, that person may tell me, well, Angela, you cannot see your friends and family. Right. So, that's something to think about. Am I in a relationship where this is happening? Right. Another way you can tell if you're in a really abusive relationship, it's kind of like thinking about control issues, right? Does that person control where I go, what I wear, who I see, and what I do? Right? And it's one thing to be in a relationship for a person to be concerned, but the other thing is if that person is controlling all of those aspects of your life, right? That's something to think about. I could be in an abusive relationship if this happens. If you're with someone where their personality is unpredictable, right? Because one thing about being in a healthy relationship, it's pretty stable. You kind of can know how that person's going to be. But with an abusive person, it's like their behavior is kind of unpredictable. They almost have what we call Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde kind of personality. Right? So based on those things that I've listed so far, if you're questioning whether you're in an abusive relationship, you may be if you have more than one of those characteristics or attributes going on in a relationship. Again, my name is Angela Moss. If you're just tuning in, I am a domestic violence counselor and advocate from Connections for Abused Women and Their Children, and I'm at their satellite office. So you can definitely call in to the show to ask any questions or comments. The telephone number would be 312-738-1060. If you didn't want to call in, but you want to call in to our 24-hour hotline, you can do that. You can speak to someone 24 hours a day, confidential, and you can ask a number of questions related to the topics that I'm talking about or any other topics. So real quick, I will put up here the overhead So you can see the number to the agency 24-hour hotline. It's 773-278-4566. There's people on that hotline who speak different languages or try to connect you to someone from another hotline to be able to give you, so that you can speak in the language in which you feel most comfortable. Also with CAWC, what I will say is that, of course, we have the program that I spoke to you about at Haymarket. We have a shelter program. We have a program which we call HPOP, which is walk-in for individual group counseling. We have a program at Northwestern and at John Stroger Hospital, or Cook County, however you remember the hospital name to be, same program. So you can always seek out services at those programs if you are at any of those facilities to be able to look for domestic violence. I'll go on. So we already talked about how you can identify some ways of being in an abusive relationship, right? So the next point that I'm going to talk about is what does an abusive person look like, right? An abusive person looks like any person. They may look like me, right? But once you get to be in this relationship with that individual, you start to notice some characteristics or some traits that may be unhealthy and turn out to be abusive. So being with someone who is jealous, right? Jealous is definitely one of those character traits that may identify or may say that someone's in an abusive relationship. Jealous. Then I talked about earlier, a person being controlling. Something else to look for in terms of character traits of an abusive person, right, is like they like to isolate, right? What does isolation look like? Isolation looks like that person doesn't want you to be around family or friends. The individual may not want you to have literature, paperwork, go to meetings if you're in sobriety, right? The person just wants to keep you all to themselves, right? That's a very dangerous relationship to be in, specifically when the power and control is imbalanced in a relationship. So that's some things that you want to think about if you're questioning whether or not you're in an abusive relationship. So again, my name is Angela Moss. I am a domestic violence counselor and advocate from Connections for Abused Women and Their Children at Haymarket Center, our satellite site. You can call in to the show right now to ask any questions or comments that you want in terms of domestic violence. I'll do my best to answer them for you. Also, if you are dealing with an abusive situation and you don't want to call the air for confidentiality reasons or things of that nature, you can always call a 24-hour hotline. I will definitely put the number up there for you again. The number to the 24-hour hotline is 773-278-4566. Just remember, all of the services on that hotline is free, no charge. You can speak to someone in whatever preferred language you have or you desire. You can ask different questions, so we can deal with a number of issues on that hotline. It can be, for some people, when they're in abusive relationships, they may be questioning whether they're in an abusive relationship. You can have that confidential telephone call, conversation about that. For some people, it's about, I already know that I'm in an abusive relationship, but I'm kind of fearful and I'm kind of afraid, and I don't want to leave, but and I don't know what to do. So on the hotline number, you can call in to talk about safety measures, right? Safety considerations, risk factors, because it can be very risky to be in an abusive relationship. And also when you try to leave too, that's when, the abuse escalates, and sometimes a person may be killed or severely harmed in an abusive relationship. So sometimes a person may need to process that kind of stuff. How do I leave safely? And you can do that on the hotline. We can also discuss certain legal issues with you. There are no lawyers on the hotline, but there are certain areas of expertise or specialty that the folks on the hotline will have to be able to process, some legal things with you as it pertains to domestic violence only. Right. So right now, again, you're watching Hotline 21. My name is Angela Moss, and I'm talking about different aspects of domestic violence. So if you're just tuning in, I've kind of went through some different signs to let you know that you could be in an abusive relationship, right? One of the other things that I didn't talk about in terms of a sign could be what we call verbal abuse. Verbal abuse is when you're with someone in a relationship that kind of puts you down, talks about you, belittle you in certain ways, right? But I'm also going to put this wheel up here and see if we can see it, and we'll talk from the wheel. So on this wheel, you're going to have power and control, which is in the middle. And this lets you know that an abusive relationship is all about power and control. You know, it's kind of unequal, right? But once that wheel starts to spin, you're going to see some of the things that we talked about. Just as a recap, if you're just tuning in, isolation, right? You're with someone that controls a lot of different aspects about who you're with, where you're going, and different things like that. Then we talked about, well, we didn't talk about, but we can talk about over here what would be economic or what we call financial abuse. What that looks like would be you're in an abusive relationship with someone who controls the finances. That person may give you money at times, but then when they become angry or try to, or not okay with something you said or did, they may tell you, I'm not giving you that money, right? Or being with an individual that gives you an allowance, sabotaging your work environment, your place of employment, not allowing you to have access to the bank account, knowledge of the bills, different things like that. So that would be what we call economic, financial, or financial abuse. Same type of abuse, different terminology. Right. Something else to look in terms of power and control type relationships would be children. Sometimes in abusive relationships, if there are children involved, that abusive person may use the children, right? And, you know, one way that they may use the children is trying to ask children certain questions. You know, who the other parent has been around. Also, you know, I've learned calling DCFS or threatening to call DCFS on the one parent, right, as a form of power and control issues, but also undermining the other parent's parenting style, right? You may have that victim that parents the child in one way, and then you may have the abuser who kind of you know, is not okay with that. So they undermine their parenting, maybe telling them some things like you're not a good parent. What kind of person would do that? So they question their parenting style to make that person feel like an inadequate parent. So using children happens in an abusive relationship. I think another important one is this one up here in the top. It is intimidation. Intimidation will look like, you can have intimidation being direct and indirect in terms of intimidation. So a direct intimidation will be throwing things, yelling, screaming, punching holes in the walls, right? But then you also have intimidation in terms of that person making certain kind of eye contact or indirect gesturing. This kind of gesturing, only the victim will understand it. For example, I may be in an abusive relationship. Me and the person that I'm with, we're at a party, right? And so that person may disapprove of something that I do, so they give me that look, right? For other people in the party, you may not know what that means, but as a victim, I may become afraid. I might abruptly leave the party because I know that that look or that body language means that oh my God, the person's upset. Something happened. I don't know why they're mad, but they can be really upset, right? So that's what intimidation looks like inside of an abusive relationship. So if you're just tuning in, my name is Angela Moss. I'm a domestic violence counselor and advocate from Connections for Abused Women and Their Children, and I am a full-time counselor at our satellite office, which is Haymarket Center. If you want to call in to the show right now, you can. There's people at the phone right now that can put you through. Telephone number here to the studio is 312-738-1060. If you feel uncomfortable and you don't want to call into the show, again, you can always call the agency's 24-hour hotline. The number is 773-278-4566, and you can talk to someone on the hotline as well. Right, so far I've talked about different red flags, how a person may try to identify if they're in an abusive relationship, right? The next thing I want to talk about in terms of domestic violence education is something we call the cycle of violence, right? We talk about the cycle of violence in the field of domestic violence. It's because we want to let folks know in abusive relationships that, violence is like cyclical, right? Goes in this circle and it starts and stops and things of that nature. So what I will do also, I will put the cycle of violence here, and then we can talk about it a little bit. Okay. The cycle of violence is also very important to talk about in terms of domestic violence, right? If you can see the cycle, and if not, I'll explain it to you if you can't see it. But it has 3 different phases to it, right? And so the first part of that cycle is what we call tension building. And so when you're in the tension building phase of a cycle, that batterer and that victim and also children are going to have certain kind of feelings in that relationship, right? So the tension may just be a buildup of constant arguments and fights, right? Once that will start to spin, right, you may go over to what we call the acute explosion stage, right, which is the second stage of the cycle of violence. An acute explosion stage here is where you have some type of violence happening here, right? And it can be the physical violence that we talked about, or it can be any other types of abuse that I talked about earlier. I talked about isolation, financial abuse, using of children, control, jealousy. So there's all kinds of types of abuse that may happen in this acute explosion phase, right? So it's important to remember that, because every time this wheel spins, there may be a different type of abuse that comes up. That's why earlier I spent time giving you all the different types of abuse so that you can have that education that it might not always be physical or always financial, right? And then third part of the phase, cycle of violence, would be the honeymoon, right? Just like what it sounds like, right? The honeymoon would be in that relationship when that abusive person is kind of nice. They're kind of sweet, which can be very confusing for that victim in that relationship, right? Because you've known this person to be nice, caring, compassionate, understanding, to this person that's very abusive, right? That does all of these different tactics of abuse, but then again to become really sweet and nice and charismatic again. So that's the honeymoon stage. One thing about the honeymoon stage is it can be very, very confusing. It can be confusing for the victim, and if there's children in there, because you never know what that person's going to allow you to do in the honeymoon stage. So it can be kind of tricky, because abusive people, what they do is they kind of allow the victim to have certain privileges when it's the honeymoon stage. So for example, earlier we talked about an abusive person isolating the victim in a relationship. So when it's that honeymoon stage and that person is getting ready to leave, that abusive person may say, you know what? You haven't seen your kids, you haven't seen your family, different things like that. So go see your friends, go see your family, right? And so for a victim, that sounds really, really nice. And they also become really hopeful, right? They become hopeful that, oh, this person is going back to that same individual that I met, right? The honeymoon phase, it can be pretty tricky. Also, if you have any questions or comments, you might want to go ahead and call in. We only have 5 minutes left to the show. Telephone number is 312-738-1060. Again, my name is Angela Moss, domestic violence counselor and advocate from Connections for Abused Women and Their Children at our satellite site, Haymarket Center. If you don't get a chance to call in, that's fine too. We have a 24-hour hotline at the agency, and I put it up a couple times and I put it up again for some people who didn't see the number. 24-hour hotline for Connections for Abused Women and Their Children, 773-278-4566. You can call in and ask any questions or comments that you may have in terms of domestic violence. So yes, we were just talking about, as I was wrapping it up, we were talking about the cycle of violence, right? It is this confusing cycle that a victim may go through, while they're in an abusive relationship. And I repeated that, I will repeat, it's 3 phases to it: the tension building, the acute explosion, and the honeymoon stage. Right. So since we have a couple more minutes, I can conclude by talking about or giving some information about if there's all these types of abuse, if these are all the warning signs, there's a cycle involved. Why do people stay in those kind of relationships, right? It's not always an easy answer, but all people in relationships, have some legitimate cause for staying in an abusive relationship. It's not because they like it. It can be things like fear of a lot of different things. It can be fear of losing your children. It can be fear of or loss of being in a relationship. It can be fear that once you leave that person, they may try to track you down, find you, hurt you, continue to be abusive, right? So it's fears in that way. That person may stay in their relationship because of immigration stuff, other legal issues, economic, financial reasons. Maybe that abusive person is the breadwinner in the relationship and they have all the money. It can be for reasons we talked about, children. A person may stay in an abusive relationship for that reason. They may say because they don't have any support systems. Because when a person's in an abusive relationship, sometimes they lose all of their support due to their abuse. It can be family and friends, right? Which, is not a good thing to lose your family and friends when you're in an abusive relationship. But sometimes, unfortunately, because of the lack of understanding or education about domestic violence, most people, and for other reasons, they decide, let me leave that victim be or let that person be and let them deal with their own relationship, which puts that victim in a very dangerous situation when you leave them isolated with someone that's controlling and abusive, right? That person may stay in that abusive relationship also because they feel like they can't get anybody else. Right? The truth of the matter is that abuse happens for those reasons. So again, this is Hotline 21. My name is Angela Moss. At this point, I have been talking to you about domestic violence situations. If you didn't get a chance to call in, that's fine. But I will put up the agency information one more time before I get off the air so that you'll have it. Agency number 773-278-4566. 4566. You can call this number if you want to talk about any intimate details about your relationship, if you feel that it's abusive, or even if you're questioning abuse. You can call this hotline. Again, if you need any things in terms of safety planning or things of that nature, or even want to know more about our services at our agency, you can give us a call. Again, you have been watching Hotline 21. My name is Angela Moss. Thank you and enjoy your evening.